County Sheriff announces investigators had completed their search.
The scene is done. We're done with the residents. We have turned that over to the family.
But a day after, the sheriff said that the property was sealed off, this time by the FBI.
2 days after Nancy Guthrie was abducted from her home in the Catalina foothills, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood in front of cameras and said 4 words about her property. The scene is done. 24 hours later, the FBI resealed it. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because in the gap between what the sheriff declared and what the FBI did, there is a pattern. A documented, verifiable pattern drawn from the sheriff's own press conference statements, the Bureau's subsequent actions, and confirmed reporting from multiple credible outlets. This video is not about the abduction itself. That analysis is already in the record. This is about what happened to the investigation after the abduction. Who controlled information, what they said publicly, what they omitted, and what the institutional record tells us about how those decisions shaped the evidentiary infrastructure of this case. If you're watching this because you want forensic analysis grounded in the actual evidentiary record, not speculation or sensationalism, then Crime Case Analyst is the channel you've been looking for. Hit that subscribe button right now and give this video a like, so this kind of precise breakdown reaches the people who need to see it. We examine the institutional decisions behind major investigations with the same rigor we apply to the evidence itself. Turn on notifications because every breakdown publishes Thursday at 6 p.m., and you do not want to miss what comes next. We are going to examine 4 specific failures, not alleged, documented, publicly verifiable, each grounded in the sheriff's own words and the evidence that contradicted them. We are also going to examine the timeline around Tommaso Cioni, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, the man who drove her home on the night of January 31st, 2026, waited until she was inside, and drove away. A man who has been formally cleared by the Pima County Sheriff's Department as a suspect, and whose testimony establishes the final verified endpoint of the known safe timeline. The connection between the sheriff's institutional decisions and the information surrounding that drop-off is not speculative. It is in the record. And that is what we are here to examine. The methodology remains constant. When I say confirmed, I mean it is documented in law enforcement statements, federal filings, or verified reporting from multiple credible outlets. When I say this suggests or in my assessment, I am drawing an analytical inference from the evidentiary record. I will make that distinction explicit throughout. Because in a case of this complexity, the space between what is known and what is assumed must be kept visible. Let us establish the factual baseline before we examine it. January 31st, 2026, 9:48 p.m. Tommaso Cioni drives Nancy Guthrie to her home in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. Per the sheriff's confirmed statement, Cioni waited in his vehicle outside until Nancy had entered the home before he drove away. The garage door system log corroborates this precisely. The door opens at 9:48 p.m. It closes at 9:50 p.m. That 2-minute window is her entering her home. Cioni has been formally cleared. That is confirmed and documented. What is also confirmed is that he is the last person to see Nancy Guthrie alive and unharmed. His statement provides the foundational endpoint to the known safe timeline. Everything that follows must be reconstructed from physical evidence, digital logs, and the behavioral record of an unknown perpetrator. That reconstruction depends entirely on the integrity of the investigative response. February 1st, 2026, 11:56 a.m. Family members arrive. Nancy is missing. 12:03 p.m. The 911 call is made. 2 days later, the sheriff holds a press conference and declares the scene complete. The FBI is back on that property within 24 hours. Failure 1. The premature crime scene release. In forensic investigation, a crime scene is a controlled environment. It is sealed because everything inside it, every surface, every object, every microscopic biological trace, is potential evidence. Evidence that can be contaminated, degraded, or permanently destroyed by uncontrolled human contact. Returning a crime scene to a family before the investigation is complete is not a minor procedural detail. It is a consequential institutional decision with irreversible implications. Sheriff Nanos made that decision 48 hours after the abduction. The FBI reversed it within 24 hours. What that tells us is specific. The FBI assessed that property as not yet forensically exhausted. That additional evidentiary value remained in that space that had not been extracted. The sheriff's determination, the scene is done, did not reflect the Bureau's operational assessment. We do not know what evidence, if any, was compromised in that window. That is not a claim being made here. What we do know is that the gap exists. It is documented in the public record. It has never been adequately explained. And in a case where DNA is the single most consequential forensic artifact, any unresolved question about the integrity of the crime scene collection process is not a peripheral concern. It is central to every analytical conclusion that follows. Let me pause here and explain why this matters from a purely technical standpoint. When a crime scene is released, it means law enforcement has made a determination that they have extracted all forensically valuable evidence from that location. In practical terms, this means biological samples have been collected and documented. Surfaces have been processed for latent prints. Digital devices have been cataloged and imaged. Spatial relationships have been photographed and measured. And trace evidence like fibers, hair, or soil has been recovered. This process is methodical. It is slow. And it is conducted under the assumption that once the scene is released, the controlled conditions necessary for forensic collection no longer exist. When family members return to a property, they understandably interact with that environment. They move objects, they clean surfaces, they occupy space. None of this is malicious. It is human. But from a forensic perspective, every interaction is a potential disruption to the evidentiary record. A surface that might have held touch DNA is wiped down. A carpet that might have retained transfer fibers is vacuumed. A door handle that could have been reprocessed for prints is used repeatedly. In cases where initial collection efforts were thorough and complete, this may not matter. But in cases where the initial determination was premature, the consequences are permanent. The FBI's decision to reseal the property tells us their assessment differed from the sheriff's. It tells us they believed additional forensic work was necessary. What it does not tell us is what, if anything, was lost in the window between the sheriff's release and the Bureau's reseal. That is the evidentiary gap. And it is a gap that exists not because of what we know, but because of what we cannot know. Because once a crime scene is released and then reestablished, the question of whether evidence was compromised in that interval becomes impossible to answer definitively. Sheriff Nanos has not publicly explained the decision to release the scene after 48 hours. He has not addressed why the FBI felt it necessary to reverse that decision. In the absence of that explanation, what remains is the institutional record. A sheriff who declared the scene complete, a federal agency that disagreed, and an evidentiary timeline with a documented gap. Failure 2. The Google Nest camera explanation. February 5, 2026. Sheriff Nanos holds another press conference. He addresses the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home, a Google Nest device, and explains that it had gone offline due to no active subscription. He describes it as a technical loop. He says, and I'm quoting directly, "It would rewrite itself, kind of. It just kind of loops, right, and covers up." That explanation matters, because it is incomplete. Here is what the factual record shows. The camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 a.m., its motion detection hardware registered a figure approaching the front door, masked, gloved, carrying a backpack, and wearing a visible holster. The sheriff stated there was no video footage associated with that detection event. The FBI later recovered footage from Google's cloud servers. I want you to hold those two statements together and understand precisely what the gap between them means. The sheriff characterized the camera as effectively non-functional, a device that had lapsed due to subscription failure and could not reliably record. The FBI then retrieved footage from that same device's cloud infrastructure. The question the sheriff's explanation never answered is this: If the camera was offline due to a subscription lapse, how was footage available on Google's servers at all? The answer is in how Nest's infrastructure operates. Cloud-connected devices like the Google Nest log connectivity events, motion detection triggers, and network handshakes independently of their active subscription status. The local recording of continuous video may lapse. The cloud metadata does not. It is transmitted and stored on Google's server infrastructure, regardless of whether the end user is paying for a subscription plan. An attacker can disable a camera. An attacker can prevent it from capturing new footage. What an attacker cannot do is retroactively erase the metadata logs already transmitted to cloud servers, not without gaining unauthorized access to Google's secure infrastructure, which is a substantially more difficult task than disabling a doorbell camera. Let me explain the technical distinction here because it is critical to understanding what the sheriff's statement actually conveyed versus what the device was capable of. Google Nest cameras operate on a tiered service model. With an active subscription, users get continuous video recording stored in the cloud, extended playback history, and advanced features like facial recognition and activity zones. Without a subscription, the camera still functions, but its cloud recording is limited. It will capture short clips triggered by motion or sound, typically between 30 seconds and 3 minutes, and store them for a limited period, often 3 hours. Even without a subscription, the device maintains network connectivity, logs motion events, and transmits data packets to Google's servers. What this means in operational terms is that even if Nancy Guthrie did not have an active Nest-aware subscription, the camera at her front door was still capable of capturing triggered video clips and transmitting them to the cloud. The sheriff's characterization that the camera was looping and effectively overwriting itself suggests a misunderstanding of how the device handles data when subscription services lapse. Nest cameras do not continuously overwrite cloud data like a local DVR system with limited storage. They transmit event-triggered clips to Google's infrastructure, where that data persists according to Google's retention policies, not the user's subscription status. The FBI's subsequent recovery of footage from Google's servers confirms this. They did not retrieve footage from the physical device at Nancy's home. They retrieved it from Google's cloud architecture, which means the footage was transmitted and stored remotely. The sheriff's public explanation did not account for this. It characterized the camera as non-functional in a way that was technically inaccurate, and that inaccuracy entered the public record uncorrected for weeks. Here is why that matters. When law enforcement publicly characterizes a piece of evidence as non-functional or unavailable, that statement has consequences. It shapes media coverage, it influences public perception, and in cases with significant rewards and public attention, it potentially signals to interested parties, including the perpetrator, what investigators do or do not have. If the sheriff's explanation led anyone following this case to believe that the doorbell camera at 2:12 a.m. captured nothing, that belief was based on an incomplete characterization of the technology and the evidentiary record. The sheriff either did not understand how the device's cloud architecture functioned, which represents a technical gap in the institutional leadership of a major federal case, or he understood it and chose not to explain it publicly. Both possibilities are significant. One reflects an information deficit. The other reflects an information decision. What is documented is this. The public characterization of the camera as non-functional introduced a factual error into the investigative record that circulated uncorrected in media coverage for weeks, and it potentially answered a question the perpetrator may have been asking, whether the camera at 2:12 a.m. had captured anything. Before we continue, if you're finding this level of analysis valuable, take 5 seconds right now and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. Hit the like button and drop a comment letting me know what you think about this breakdown. This kind of work takes time and research, and the algorithm rewards engagement. If you want more of this, help it reach the people who need to see it. Turn on notifications so you are here when the next breakdown drops Thursday at 6 p.m. Failure 3. The Video Perimeter Disclosure. February 5th. The same press conference. Sheriff Nanos confirms that investigators have requested footage from cameras within a 2-mile radius of Nancy Guthrie's home. Fox News simultaneously reports on footage of a vehicle captured approximately 2.5 miles from her home, outside the perimeter. Evidence investigators had not yet located, identified not by law enforcement canvassing beyond their stated boundary, but by a national news outlet. The forensic significance of that disclosure sequence is not subtle. When law enforcement announces the specific geographic radius of their video evidence request, they are placing into public record, and into the hands of anyone following this case closely, the precise boundary where their surveillance collection ends. 2.5 miles. That is the number. And the evidence at 2.5 miles was found by Fox News. This is not a claim that the disclosure was made with intent to compromise the investigation. The sheriff's stated rationale for public communication throughout this case has been one of transparency. But in forensic analysis, intent and consequence are separate questions. The intent may be transparency. The consequence is documented. A publicly announced perimeter that was exceeded by evidence investigators had not yet secured. Let me walk you through what this means operationally. In the early stages of an abduction investigation, particularly one where the timeline is compressed and the suspect is unidentified, video canvassing is one of the primary investigative tools. Detectives and federal agents identify a geographic zone around the victim's last known location and systematically request footage from every home, business, and municipal camera within that radius. The goal is to capture vehicular movement, identify patterns, and establish suspect vehicles or routes of travel. This process is resource-intensive. It requires personnel to knock on doors, contact businesses, issue subpoenas, and manually review hours of footage. The radius of that canvas is determined by investigative strategy, resource availability, and the assessed likelihood of evidentiary value at increasing distances from the primary scene. The 2-mile radius is significant. It represents a deliberate operational boundary. What happens when that boundary is disclosed publicly is this. Anyone with access to camera footage beyond that radius now knows their footage has not been requested. If they are a cooperative homeowner or business, they may not think to contact law enforcement because they assume investigators have already canvassed their area. If they are the perpetrator, they now know where the surveillance net ends. Fox News identified footage of a vehicle 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. That is half a mile beyond the publicly disclosed perimeter. We do not know when that footage was identified relative to the sheriff's announcement. We do not know whether investigators were already aware of it. What we do know is that the evidence was reported by a media outlet, not confirmed by law enforcement, which suggests it was not part of the initial canvass. The sheriff's disclosure of the 2-mile radius created a publicly known gap, and evidence was found in that gap by someone other than investigators. This is not an accusation of intentional compromise, but it is a documented consequence of a disclosure decision. In operational security terms, announcing the specific parameters of an active investigative effort while that effort is still ongoing provides actionable intelligence to anyone paying attention. It tells them where to look for gaps. It tells them what investigators do not yet have. And in a case where the suspect is unidentified and potentially monitoring media coverage, every piece of actionable intelligence has forensic cost. Sheriff Nanos has consistently stated his commitment to transparency. Transparency in law enforcement is not inherently problematic. In some cases, public appeals generate leads that would not otherwise surface. Witnesses come forward. Tips are called in. Community cooperation increases. But transparency is a tool, not a principle. And like any tool, its value is determined by how and when it is used. In forensic terms, the decision to publicly announce the radius of an active video canvas while that canvas is still in progress is a trade-off. The benefit is public awareness and potential community assistance. The cost is operational security. What the institutional record shows is that in this case, the cost materialized. Evidence outside the perimeter was identified by a news outlet, not by the investigative team. Failure 4. The Cioni timeline and information management. Tommaso Cioni's name entered the public record early. The sheriff confirmed it. He confirmed the drop-off time, the fact that Cioni waited, the garage door log. He confirmed Cioni's formal clearance. Here is what that confirmation did. It placed a named, cleared individual into the center of a national missing persons case with a $1.1 million reward, FBI involvement, and a media presence spanning every major outlet. In investigative practice, there is a reason law enforcement typically does not publicly name individuals who have been cleared in the early stages of an active investigation. Not to protect those individuals, because every named individual in a high-profile public case becomes a focal point for audience speculation, media reconstruction, and in cases involving significant financial rewards, uncoordinated external investigation. Each of those generates noise. And in forensic work, noise is the operational enemy of signal. The investigative signal in this case, the actual evidentiary threads capable of leading to the perpetrator, was already difficult to isolate. The DNA was mixed and required deconvolution. The camera footage had been publicly mischaracterized. The perimeter had been disclosed and exceeded. Introducing a named, cleared individual into the public record in the first week of an active investigation is a judgment call. There are legitimate arguments for transparency. There are also legitimate forensic arguments against early naming. What the record shows is the consequence. Cioni's name entered public discourse in week 1. The details of his interaction with Nancy that night, the drop-off time, the waiting, the garage door log, became narrative material. And once narrative material is in the public record of a case of this visibility, it does not remain neutral. It becomes the scaffolding on which public theories are built. The information that Cioni drove away at 9:50 p.m. established a critical operational window for anyone paying attention. It told the public, and anyone else following closely, that between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m., a period of 3 hours and 57 minutes, Nancy Guthrie was alone inside her home with no confirmed external contact. That is the window the perpetrator exploited, and the specific parameters of that window were placed in the public record before investigators had fully reconstructed what occurred within it. Let me be explicit about what I am saying here and what I am not saying. I am not suggesting Tommaso Cioni is a suspect. He has been formally cleared by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. That clearance is part of the confirmed record, and it is not in dispute. What I am examining is the institutional decision to publicly name and detail the timeline of a cleared witness in the first week of an active abduction investigation. That decision had consequences for the informational landscape of this case. When Cioni's name was released, it was accompanied by specific details: the time he dropped Nancy off, the fact that he waited in his vehicle, the garage door timestamps. These details establish the endpoint of the known safe timeline with precision. 9:50 p.m., Nancy Guthrie enters her home. Tommaso Cioni drives away. From that moment forward, she is alone. What happens between 9:50 p.m. and the moment the perpetrator enters her home at approximately 1:47 a.m. is the core investigative question, and the public now knew, down to the minute, when that window opened. In cases involving unknown perpetrators, the operational window is one of the most closely guarded pieces of information in an investigation. It defines the time frame during which the crime occurred. It establishes the parameters within which suspects must be placed or eliminated. It structures the entire investigative timeline. When that window is disclosed publicly, especially in granular detail, it provides anyone following the case with the same temporal framework investigators are working from. For cooperative witnesses and the general public, that may not matter. For perpetrator monitoring coverage, it confirms exactly what law enforcement knows about when the crime occurred. I want to be clear. The decision to release Cioni's name and timeline may have been made for sound investigative reasons. Public confirmation of his clearance prevents speculation. It signals to the community that law enforcement has accounted for the people closest to the victim. It may also generate tips from individuals who saw Cioni's vehicle or were in the area during that time frame. These are legitimate considerations, but they exist in tension with the operational security concerns I have outlined. And what the record shows is that those concerns materialized. Cioni became a focal point of media coverage. His name appeared in national outlets. The timeline he provided became the foundation of public understanding of when Nancy was last seen. And the 3-hour and 57-minute window between his departure and the camera disconnect became the accepted operational timeframe for the abduction. All of this occurred in the first week of the investigation, before forensic analysis of the scene was complete, before the DNA results were available, and before the FBI had resealed the property. The broader pattern here is one of early disclosure. The scene was released early. The camera was characterized early. The perimeter was announced early. Cioni's timeline was confirmed early. Each of these decisions, individually, can be defended as part of a transparent public communication strategy. But cumulatively, they represent a pattern of information management that prioritized public disclosure over operational security. And in a case where the suspect is unidentified, highly organized, and likely monitoring coverage, that pattern has forensic cost. That cost is not always measurable. We do not know if the perpetrator saw the sheriff's press conferences. We do not know if the disclosure of the 2-mile perimeter affected the suspect's behavior. We do not know if the characterization of the camera as non-functional provided reassurance. These are not claims being made. What we do know is that each disclosure created the possibility of those consequences. And in forensic practice, possibility is risk. Risk that could have been managed differently. 4 failures. The premature crime scene release, reversed by the FBI within 24 hours. The incomplete camera explanation, contradicted by the FBI's subsequent cloud recovery. The perimeter disclosure, exceeded by evidence a news network found first. The early naming of a cleared witness, which introduced narrative noise at the most forensically critical stage of an active investigation. None of these constitute criminal conduct. None are being characterized here as deliberate acts of sabotage in the conventional sense. Sheriff Nanos has consistently stated his commitment to transparency and the pursuit of justice in this case. But in forensic analysis, institutional decisions that affect the integrity of the evidentiary record, the operational security of an active investigation, or the accuracy of the public factual baseline, those decisions have consequences. Consequences that can be measured against the evidentiary record that follows them. The question this analysis raises is not whether these failures were intentional. The question is whether the decisions made in the first 2 weeks of this investigation about what to release, when to release it, how accurately to characterize the evidence, and how to manage the public record of a named cleared witness created conditions that made this case harder to close. Let me address the argument that will inevitably be raised in response to this analysis. Transparency is not sabotage. Public communication is not obstruction. A sheriff who holds press conferences and answers questions is not by definition compromising an investigation. I agree with all of that. Transparency in law enforcement is valuable. Public trust is built on communication, and in missing persons cases, media coverage can generate tips that solve cases. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the specific disclosures made in the first 2 weeks of the Nancy Guthrie investigation were consistent with sound forensic practice. Whether the characterization of the camera was accurate, whether the scene was released prematurely, whether the perimeter should have been disclosed while the canvas was active, whether naming a cleared witness in the first week served the investigative interest or the public interest. These are not questions of intent. They are questions of consequence. And the consequences are in the record. The institutional record, examined in sequence, suggests they did. It suggests that the decisions made about what to disclose and when to disclose it created informational conditions that favored noise over signal, public narrative over operational security, and transparency over precision. Whether those conditions affected the outcome of the investigation is not something we can determine from the public record. But we can determine that they existed. We can document them, and we can hold them up against the standard of forensic best practice and ask whether they met it. Here is what that assessment looks like. In forensic practice, crime scenes are held until federal partners confirm they are forensically exhausted. In this case, the scene was released in 48 hours and resealed by the FBI within 24. In forensic practice, technical explanations of evidence are expected to be accurate. In this case, the characterization of the Nest camera as non-functional was contradicted by the FBI's subsequent cloud recovery. In forensic practice, operational parameters like surveillance perimeters are not disclosed while the canvas is active. In this case, the perimeter was announced publicly, and evidence outside that perimeter was found by a news outlet. In forensic practice, cleared witnesses are not typically named in the first week of a high-profile investigation. In this case, Cioni's name, timeline, and relationship to the victim were confirmed in multiple press conferences before the forensic analysis was complete. Each of these represents a deviation from standard investigative protocol. Each can be explained. But explanation is not the same as justification, and justification is not the same as sound practice. What we are left with is a pattern, a documented, verifiable pattern of disclosure decisions that introduced risk into the investigative process at the stage when that process was most vulnerable. Tommaso Cioni drove away from Nancy Guthrie's home at 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026. He is not a suspect. That is confirmed, and it is not in question here. But the institutional handling of the information he provided, and the broader pattern of disclosure decisions that surrounded it, is precisely what this channel exists to examine. The methodology does not change. The evidence, the institutional decisions behind it, and the precise moments where the trajectory of this investigation was shaped by choices that could have gone differently. If you are still watching, you understand that this kind of analysis is not about generating outrage. It is about accountability. It is about holding institutional decisions to the same evidentiary standard we apply to every other aspect of forensic work. If that is the kind of content you want to see more of, subscribe to Crime Case Analyst right now. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who follows this case. The next breakdown in this series examines the ransom correspondence, the forensic assessment of origin, credibility, and what the communications record tells us about how information in this case is being managed by more than one party. That analysis publishes Thursday at 6 p.m. The timestamp will be in the description. If this breakdown was useful, share it. Not for engagement, because this kind of analysis belongs in the public conversation about this case. That work continues. Now let me take you deeper into the institutional context that makes these 4 failures not just significant in isolation, but part of a larger pattern of how high-profile investigations are managed when media attention, public pressure, and institutional priorities collide. Because what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case is not unique. It is part of a documented pattern of how law enforcement agencies navigate the tension between investigative integrity and public communication. And understanding that pattern is essential to understanding why the decisions made in this case matter. Law enforcement agencies operate in a fundamentally different informational environment than they did 20 years ago. The rise of social media, the 24-hour news cycle, the proliferation of true crime content, and the increasing expectation of real-time transparency have created a pressure system that shapes how agencies communicate about active investigations. That pressure is real. It is not imagined. And it is not always wrong. Public interest in criminal cases can generate tips. It can maintain attention on unsolved crimes. It can create accountability. But it also creates risk. And the question any agency faces in a high-profile case is how to balance the value of public communication against the operational cost of disclosure. That balance is a judgment call. Different agencies handle it differently. The FBI, for example, operates under a policy of minimal public disclosure during active investigations. They confirm that an investigation is ongoing. They issue public appeals for specific information when operationally useful. But they do not hold daily press conferences. They do not characterize evidence in detail. They do not name cleared witnesses. This is not because the FBI is secretive by nature. It is because their institutional experience has taught them that in cases involving unknown suspects, operational security is more valuable than public reassurance. Sheriff Nanos took a different approach. From the first days of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, he held multiple press conferences. He answered questions from reporters. He provided details about the timeline, the evidence, the scope of the canvass, and the status of individuals connected to the case. His stated rationale, repeated in multiple press conferences, was transparency. He wanted the public to know that law enforcement was actively working the case. He wanted to maintain public trust. He wanted to reassure the community that this was not being ignored. Those are legitimate institutional goals, but they exist in tension with the operational requirements of an active investigation. And what the record shows is that in several instances, the tension was resolved in favor of disclosure. The scene was released to maintain forward momentum. The camera was explained to address public questions. The perimeter was announced to encourage community cooperation. Cioni's clearance was confirmed to prevent speculation. Each of these decisions served a communication goal, but each also carried operational cost. Here is where the pattern becomes critical. Because what the institutional record shows is that when those costs materialized, when the FBI resealed the seam, when the camera explanation was contradicted, when evidence was found outside the disclosed perimeter, the sheriff's public communication did not adjust. There was no follow-up press conference explaining why the FBI disagreed with the scene release. There was no clarification of how the Nest camera actually functioned. There was no acknowledgement that the 2-mile perimeter had been exceeded. The disclosures were made. The consequences followed. And the public record was left uncorrected. That is not transparency. That is incomplete communication. And in a case where public understanding of the evidence directly affects the informational environment in which the investigation operates, incomplete communication has forensic consequences. It allows inaccurate narratives to circulate. It allows evidentiary gaps to go unexamined. And it allows institutional decisions to avoid the scrutiny they would face if the full record were available. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. The sheriff's characterization of the Nest camera as non-functional due to subscription lapse entered media coverage immediately. National outlets reported that the doorbell camera had not captured footage. Local news repeated the explanation. True crime podcasts analyzed the significance of the camera being offline. For weeks, the public understanding of this case included the belief that the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home had failed to record the critical moments of the abduction. That belief was based on the sheriff's explanation. It was inaccurate. The FBI later recovered footage from Google's cloud servers, but by the time that recovery was reported, the narrative had already solidified. Now think about what that means for the investigative environment. If the perpetrator was monitoring coverage, which organized offenders often do, the sheriff's explanation may have provided reassurance. It may have signaled that the camera at 2:12 a.m. had not captured usable footage. That signal, even if unintentional, could have affected the perpetrator's behavior. It could have reduced perceived risk. It could have influenced decisions about whether to dispose of evidence, whether to remain in the area, whether to continue monitoring the case. We do not know if any of that occurred. But the possibility existed. And that possibility was created by a public characterization that was technically incomplete. The same dynamic applies to the perimeter disclosure. When the sheriff announced that investigators were canvassing a 2-mile radius, that number became public knowledge. Anyone with footage outside that radius now knew it had not been requested. If they were inclined to cooperate, they may have assumed investigators were not interested. If they were the perpetrator, they knew where the surveillance gap was. Fox News found footage at 2.5 miles. That footage may or may not have investigative value. But the fact that it was found by a media outlet rather than law enforcement tells us the canvas had not extended that far at the time of the disclosure. The perimeter announcement created a known boundary. Evidence was found beyond that boundary. That is the operational cost of the disclosure. The early naming of Tommaso Cioni follows the same pattern. His clearance was confirmed in the first week. His timeline was detailed in press conferences. His relationship to Nancy was explained. All of this served the goal of preventing speculation, but it also introduced his name into a national case with $1 million reward, intense media scrutiny, and public pressure for answers. Cioni is not a public figure. He did not seek this attention. And the institutional decision to name him publicly, even in the context of clearance, subjected him to a level of scrutiny that would not have occurred if his identity had been withheld. From a forensic perspective, the decision also introduced noise. Every named individual in a high-profile case becomes a focal point for amateur investigation, online speculation, and media reconstruction. That is not Cioni's fault. It is not the fault of the public. It is the predictable consequence of naming a cleared witness in the early stages of a highly visible investigation, and it is a consequence that could have been avoided. The institutional pattern here is one of disclosure without follow-up. Information is released to serve a communication goal. When that information is contradicted, exceeded, or proven incomplete, there is no public correction. The scene is released, the FBI reseals it, and there is no explanation. The camera is characterized as non-functional. The FBI recovers footage, and there is no clarification. The perimeter is announced, evidence is found beyond it, and there is no acknowledgement. Cioni is named, the media focuses on him, and there is no institutional effort to redirect attention back to the actual investigative priority, which is identifying an unknown perpetrator. This is not an argument that Sheriff Nanos acted with malice. It is not an argument that he intentionally compromised the investigation. It is an argument that the institutional decisions made in the first 2 weeks of this case prioritized public communication over operational security, and that those decisions had measurable consequences for the evidentiative environment in which this investigation is being conducted. Those consequences are in the record, they are documented, and they are the proper subject of forensic scrutiny. Now let us examine what the institutional record tells us about how those decisions were made and who was involved in making them. Because in a case of this scale, with FBI involvement, federal resources, and multi-agency coordination, the decision-making structure is not simple. It is not a single sheriff making unilateral calls. It is a coordinated effort involving multiple agencies, each with its own protocols, priorities, and institutional culture. Understanding that structure is essential to understanding how the failures we have documented occurred. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is the lead agency in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. That is confirmed. But lead agency does not mean sole agency. The FBI is involved. The Arizona Department of Public Safety is involved. The Tucson Police Department provided support. The U.S. Marshals Service is part of the federal task force. Each of these agencies brings resources, expertise, and institutional perspective. They also bring bureaucratic complexity. In multi-agency investigations, decision-making authority is negotiated, not assumed. Protocols must be coordinated, evidence must be shared, public communication must be cleared. What the institutional record shows is that in this case, the clearance process for public communication was either not followed or not effective. The sheriff held press conferences that disclosed operational details the FBI would typically not confirm. He characterized evidence in ways that were later contradicted by federal findings. He announced investigative parameters while the investigation was active. These are not decisions a sheriff would typically make unilaterally in a case with significant federal involvement. Which raises the question, were these decisions coordinated with federal partners? And if so, why did they proceed despite the operational risks? We do not have access to the internal communications between the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. We do not know what conversations occurred before the press conferences. We do not know whether the Bureau objected to the disclosures or endorsed them. What we do know is the outcome. The sheriff made the disclosures. The FBI then took actions that contradicted them. The scene was resealed. The footage was recovered. The perimeter was exceeded. That sequence tells us something about the coordination, or lack of coordination, between agencies. In federal investigations, the typical protocol is that the lead federal agency controls public communication. Local agencies provide support and resources, but they defer to the Bureau on what gets disclosed and when. That protocol exists precisely to prevent the kind of inconsistencies we have documented in this case. It ensures that public statements are vetted, that technical explanations are accurate, and that operational details are not disclosed prematurely. The fact that those inconsistencies occurred suggests that the protocol either was not in place or was not followed. There are several possible explanations. One is that the sheriff was operating with incomplete information. He may not have known that the FBI planned to reseal the scene. He may not have understood the full technical capabilities of the Nest camera. He may have announced the perimeter based on the initial canvas plan without knowing it would be expanded. These would represent communication failures within the investigative team, but not intentional disclosure violations. Another explanation is that the sheriff made a deliberate institutional decision to prioritize public communication over federal protocol. He may have believed that maintaining public trust required more transparency than the FBI was comfortable with. He may have assessed that the risk of speculation and rumor outweighed the operational cost of disclosure. This would represent a strategic disagreement between agencies, resolved in favor of transparency. A third explanation is that the disclosures were coordinated and approved, but the operational situation changed after they were made. The FBI may have initially agreed that the scene was complete, then reassessed based on new information. The camera may have been understood as non-functional at the time of the press conference, with the cloud recovery occurring later. The perimeter may have been accurate when announced, then expanded as new leads developed. This would mean the inconsistencies were not the result of poor communication, but of evolving investigative circumstances. We do not know which of these explanations is correct. What we do know is that the inconsistencies exist, that they are documented, and that they have consequences for the public understanding of this case. And in the absence of an institutional explanation, the most reasonable inference is that coordination between the Sheriff's Department and federal partners was not as tight as it should have been. That is not sabotage, but it is a failure of communication, a protocol, or of institutional alignment. And in a case of this complexity, those failures have operational cost. Now let me bring this back to the central question. How did the documented failures in the first 2 weeks of the Nancy Guthrie investigation connect to the broader institutional pattern of information management in high-profile cases? And what does that connection tell us about the investigative priorities that shaped this case? The connection is this. In high-profile cases, the pressure to communicate publicly is immense. Families want answers. The media demands updates. The community expects transparency. Law enforcement agencies feel that pressure acutely. And the institutional response to that pressure varies. Some agencies resist it, maintaining operational security at the cost of public frustration. Others accommodate it, prioritizing transparency at the cost of operational risk. The choice is not binary. It is a spectrum. And where an agency falls on that spectrum is determined by institutional culture, leadership priorities, and the specific circumstances of the case. Sheriff Nanos fell toward the transparency end of that spectrum. He held frequent press conferences. He answered questions in detail. He disclosed operational information that other agencies would have withheld. That choice reflected his institutional priorities. He valued public trust. He valued community engagement. He valued the perception that law enforcement was actively working the case and keeping the public informed. Those are legitimate values, but they came with operational cost. And what the record shows is that when those costs materialized, there was no institutional adjustment. The disclosures continued. The inconsistencies went unaddressed, and the public record was left incomplete. That pattern is not unique to this case. It is visible in other high-profile investigations where local agencies led cases with significant media attention. The Delphi murders, the Idaho student killings, the Molly Tibbetts case. In each, local law enforcement faced intense pressure to communicate publicly. In each, the balance between transparency and operational security was contested. And in each, the decisions made about what to disclose and when had lasting consequences for the investigation. What those cases teach us is that the institutional priority placed on public communication can either support or undermine the investigative process, depending on how it is managed. When communication is strategic, accurate, and coordinated with investigative partners, it can generate tips, maintain attention, and build public trust without compromising operational security. When communication is reactive, incomplete, or inconsistent, it introduces noise, creates informational gaps, and potentially signals to perpetrators what investigators know and do not know. The Nancy Guthrie case falls into the second category. The communication was frequent, but it was not always accurate. It was transparent, but it was not always complete. It was public, but it was not always coordinated with federal partners. And the result is a public record that contains documented inconsistencies, unexplained gaps, and unresolved questions about the integrity of the evidentiary process. Those questions do not resolve themselves, they persist. They shape the public understanding of the case. They affect the credibility of the investigation, and they create the conditions in which cases become harder to close, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the informational environment has been compromised by the decisions made about how to manage that evidence publicly. Tommaso Cioni drove away from Nancy Guthrie's home at 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026. He is not a suspect. He has been cleared. His testimony is part of the confirmed evidentiary record, but the institutional decision to name him publicly, to detail his timeline, and to confirm his clearance in the first week of an active investigation subjected him to scrutiny that could have been avoided. It introduced his name into a national case. It made him a focal point of media coverage, and it provided the public with the precise parameters of the operational window the perpetrator exploited. That decision had consequences. We can document them, we can examine them, and we can ask whether those consequences were justified by the investigative value of the disclosure. That is not an attack on Tommaso Cioni. It is not an attack on Sheriff Nanos. It is forensic accountability. It is the work of holding institutional decisions to the same evidentiary standard we apply to every other aspect of criminal investigation. And it is the work this channel exists to do. If this analysis has been valuable to you, if you believe this kind of accountability belongs in the public conversation about high-profile cases, then subscribe to Crime Case Analyst right now. Hit the like button, share this video, leave a comment. Help this reach the people who need to see it, because the work does not stop here. The next breakdown in this series examines the ransom correspondence, the forensic assessment of origin, credibility, and what the communications record tells us about how information in this case is being managed by more than one party. That analysis publishes Thursday at 6 p.m. The timestamp will be in the description. The methodology remains constant. The evidence, the institutional decisions behind it, and the precise moments where the trajectory of this investigation was shaped by choices that could have gone differently. That work continues.